What's up everybody, it's Justin and we're bringing you another dyno session with my 2017 Subaru BRZ. This one is the follow-up video to my stock BRZ power numbers, which I posted a little while back. We now have the upgrades on the car, we now have the tuning done on the car, so we're getting ready to get the power numbers and see just what kind of gains the car got from adding these upgrades. So we're going to break out from the dyno shop, take a look at the results, and then we'll throw in another pull from the dyno towards the end of the video here, just because we love to hear the car screaming at fourth gear, full throttle. Alright everybody, we're back from the dyno with my 2017 Subaru BRZ after the modifications have been done. So just to go over again what the upgrades are on the car, we have the stock airbox with the drop-in filter from Blitz, the Perrin inlet tube that covers the intake side of the engine. On the exhaust side we have the RevWorks unequal length header, the Perrin overpipe, the Burke front pipe with the high flow cat, and then the Tanabe Concept G exhaust finishing things out for the bolt-ons. For the engine tuning we have the ECU Tech custom tune. We went through about 14 or 15 different map revisions to get to where we are today. So that's what we did the power numbers on today's dyno, with those bolt-ons and that tuning. So what we're going to do is a little bit of data analysis on the dyno graphs and the results from this dyno session. So I have to admit I'm a little bit upset with the peak numbers of the car from a horsepower and torque perspective. The 2017 BRZ did not make any more power than my old FRS did from a peak power standpoint. So if we look at the graphs, let's see, my FRS made 182 horsepower peak, that was the maximum that it made, and 149 pound-feet of torque at a maximum. The BRZ, the 2017 BRZ, with virtually the same modifications, it also made 182 peak horsepower and it made 147 foot-pounds of torque, or pound-feet of torque. So a couple less on the torque from a peak standpoint, but also keep in mind these are completely different times of the year. I shot the FRS dyno in February, so the ambient temperatures, I remember it was pretty cold that day. It was snowing the day before, so that could have an effect. The ambient temperatures today for the Subaru BRZ, it was about 60 degrees and sunny, so a little bit warmer. So that definitely has an effect on the dyno numbers. Alright, so peak power numbers aside, we'll talk stock BRZ versus tuned and upgraded BRZ. Now, even in that case, the BRZ in stock form made pretty good power. It made, what did it make, 144 pound-feet of torque and 179 horsepower. And with the bolt-ons and the tuning, we made 3 more pound-feet of torque at 147 and 3 more horsepower at 182. So the peak numbers were not significantly greater over the stock BRZ. The FRS, in contrast, made a little bit less from a stock standpoint. So the stock FRS, my old orange car, it gained more from the bolt-ons and the tuning than the BRZ did. So it seems like the BRZ might be a little bit more efficient with the newer engine changes and the exhaust and intake changes that it had done to it on the stock car. So it makes more power from a stock standpoint. It just won't gain as much when you put the bolt-ons, at least in this particular one-off test that I did. Now, comparing the dyno graph from the stock BRZ to the tuned BRZ, that's where we really find the meat of the data. So peak numbers only tell one part of the story. The most important part is where are we making more power in the torque and in the horsepower curves. And on these cars, we have the torque dip in the mid-range and the low torque in the low RPM ranges. And that's where the tuning and the bolt-ons make the most difference on these cars. So looking at the graphs, you actually see the real data and what's really going on from a power standpoint. So there's huge gaps or huge leaps in power in the middle RPM range, especially from around 3,500 RPMs up to, oh, I don't know, 52 or 5,300 RPMs. There's significant power increases found there. And while it doesn't affect the peak power, that is all of the changes that you feel in the car driving around. That's why the 2017, in my opinion, feels so much quicker than the previous cars. And some of that is the gearing too, of course. But all of that power you gain in that mid-range is what you're feeling and where most of the performance is gained. One other thing I noticed with the BRZ is it kept increasing its torque curve as you go up through the rev range versus kind of plateauing and just being flat. It continued to grow from about 4,500 RPMs or so, maybe 5,000 RPMs. The torque curve steadily increased all the way up, which is good, of course. We want to see power increasing throughout the rev range, preferably to a red line, but that doesn't always work out that way. So in reality, after we look at these graphs, we can kind of see that maximum power wasn't necessarily the 3 horsepower and 3 torque on the peak. I mean, we're seeing upwards of, almost 15 horsepower, about 15 torque, and I don't know, 13 or so horsepower, 14 horsepower. So there's some big gains there in those big sections where the car was making little power in the mid-range and the upper middle range. So for me, when I look at a dyno graph, that's really what I'm looking at, is where are we making those big gains, not just on peak power, it's where are we making those change over the stock graph. So from that standpoint, I'm pretty satisfied. It's actually very similar to my FRS in the way the gains were had. The gains were in the similar areas compared to the FRS and the BRZ. Now if we look at the dyno graph from both the tuned BRZ and the tuned FRS, they are pretty close to identical. So Subaru and Toyota, they did a good job of making sure these engines were consistent, from the generations of years, at least, from my data that I've got. And while the power is made in different parts of the torque curve on the 2017, it looks like almost the power comes on a little bit sooner in some areas and a little bit later in others. But the 2017 car has a pretty similar, almost exact power curve and torque curve that the 2013 FRS did. Alright, so I think that covers everything. Cliff notes. Peak power numbers were not that impressive. 3 horsepower and 3 pound-feet of torque over the stock BRZ. But the important areas in the mid-range, all of that power, the torque gained underneath the curve was pretty good there. And most importantly, out of all of this, the car feels a whole lot better than it did stock from a power delivery standpoint. The 2017 car for sure feels quicker than my 2013 FRS, especially in the low and mid-range. And again, I think a lot of that is attributed to the gearing changes. And it's clear that these cars can make power in the same areas that the older generation cars did. It does seem that the newer cars are a little more efficient from the factory. So in the stock configuration, stock airbox, stock header, stock exhaust, all of that stuff is pretty efficient compared to the previous generation cars. So I think that's going to do it for this video. I hope you all enjoyed. I hope it was informational. And stay tuned for the next test. I'm going to throw the Grimspeed intake back on the car and see if we get more power just by changing out that part. In fact, now I'm actually really excited to get that test done, being that the peak numbers were what they were with the current configuration. So we'll see if that Grimspeed intake makes even more of a difference on the peak power numbers. So we have more content coming soon. If you liked the video, please hit the like button down below, leave your thoughts and comments. I would love to hear from you. Thanks again everybody for watching. We will talk to you all next time.